Limit as x goes to pi over 4 of 1 minus the tangent squared of x over cosine of x minus sine of x. The first thing we're going to do is plug in a pi over 4 for each of the x's. So we will have 1 minus the tangent of pi over 4 quantity squared divided by the cosine of pi over 4 minus the sine of pi over 4. Now the tangent of pi over 4 is sine of pi over 4, root 2 over 2, over the cosine of pi over 4, root 2 over 2. Root 2 over 2 over root 2 over 2 is a 1. Tangent of pi over 4 is a 1, so we have 1 minus 1 squared. And the cosine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2, minus the sine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. 1 squared is 1, so we have 1 minus 1 over root 2 over 2 minus root 2 over 2 is a 0. 1 minus 1 is also a 0, and we end up with the 0 over 0 indeterminate form. Now, this was resulting from trig functions. One of them is in a squared form, but the Pythagorean trig identity involving tangent squared will send it to secant squared, and that's not going to match any of the trig functions in the denominator. And therefore, we're not going to make use of Pythagorean trig identity. It's probably better to get the trig functions to match by turning the tangent into sine over cosine. So that's what I'm going to do next, is rewrite that tangent as sine over cosine. So limit is x goes to pi over 4 of 1 minus, now tangent squared means sine squared of x over the cosine squared of x, so we'll write it that way. And then the entire thing over the cosine of x minus the sine of x. My next step, I'm going to get a common denominator between those two fractions that are in the numerator. So I'm going to have a limit as x goes to pi over 4. I'm going to multiply 1 by cosine squared x over cosine squared x minus the sine squared x over the cosine squared x, so that I have a common denominator and I can combine them together. I'm going to leave the overall denominator alone right now. Multiplying the 1 will give us cos squared x over cos squared x minus sine squared x over cos squared x, and then all of that over the cos of x minus the sine of x. The next step is to combine those fractions over that common denominator, so that's going to give us limit as x goes to pi over 4 of cosine squared of x minus sine squared of x all over cosine squared of x. And then I'm leaving the overall denominator alone, and that's going to be all over cos x minus sine x. Now, because I have a fraction in the numerator, my next step is to reciprocate the denominator fraction and multiply it with the numerator. The denominator right now is not a fraction, so I'm going to make it a fraction by putting it over a 1. So let's go ahead and do that, in which case we can now reciprocate it and multiply it with the numerator, and that's going to be my next step. Limit as x goes to pi over 4 of cos squared x minus sine squared x divided by the cosine squared of x, and then multiplied with the reciprocal 1 over the cosine of x minus the sine of x. And now we can multiply those fractions so that we get a single fraction here, and that will give us 1 times cos squared x minus sine squared x divided by cos squared x times the cosine of x minus the sine of x. Now, I'm not going to distribute the cos squared of x in there because I'm going to need to factor and cancel. We still have 0 over 0. We haven't changed that yet. And the 0 is happening in the numerator because of this expression, which is actually a difference of squares, because the cosine of x and the sine of x actually match each other. And the same thing in the denominator, we have it because of an expression involving cosine and sine, which match each other at pi over 4. And therefore, we need to factor cancel before we remove the 0 over 0. That's going to be our next step. We're going to factor the numerator. It is a difference of squares, so it will factor into a cosine of x plus a sine of x, and a cosine of x minus a sine of x, as a difference of squares factorization. In the denominator, we have cosine squared of x, which we're just going to leave alone. And we have a cosine of x minus a sine of x. Now, it's the cosine of x minus the sine of x factors that are making 0 over 0 at pi over 4. Cosine and sine match each other, and they subtract to be a 0. We need to cancel those factors out. Once we've done that, we should now have something that is no longer 0 over 0. I'm just going to rewrite everything we have at this point. So we have the cosine of x plus the sine of x over the cosine squared of x. And we can now try plugging in a pi over 4 for each of the remaining x's. That'll give us the cosine of pi over 4 plus the sine of pi over 4 divided by the cosine of pi over 4 quantity squared. Now, the cosine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. The sine of pi over 4 is also root 2 over 2. And all of this is going to therefore be over root 2 over 2 quantity squared. Root 2 over 2 plus root 2 over 2, those are over a common denominator, so that'll be 2 root 2 over 2. And then root 2 squared is a 2, and 2 squared is a 4, 2 over 4. Now in the numerator, the 2's can cancel for a 2 root 2 over 2, and we have just a root 2. In the denominator, we can partially cancel the 2 and the 4, leaving us with a 1 and a 2, so it's over 1/2. Now we have a fraction in the denominator, and since we have a fraction in the denominator, next step is going to be reciprocate and multiply. So we're going to have root 2 times the reciprocal of 1/2, which is 2 over 1. We multiply these, we have 2 root 2 over 1, which is going to equal to 2 root 2.